Hi, everyone. Welcome to 5 Symptoms of an Unhealthy Patient Strategy. I'm Matt Weber, the president of Roar Internet Marketing and also a Google National Supported Trainer. And in both of those roles, I have the pleasure of working with health practices from all over the country, big and small, single location, multiple location. And as I've worked with them for about a decade now, I've kind of learned over the years what are some signs that I see that they may not have a fully effective digital new patient strategy. And so I've coalesced those into now what I call the 5 symptoms of an unhealthy patient strategy. You may be experiencing one, if not all of these. Some are really visible and some take a little bit more digging. And that's the purpose of today's program. What I love about working in the healthcare industry is that no matter what types of practices I work with, whether they're elective or general practitioners or hospital groups, they all are seeking different types of patients and they all have different needs and they're all providing different services. But there's one really strong common underlying element, and that is they all have consumer journeys that begin with searching on the internet. In fact, if you think about it, the digital ecosystem that we're now familiar with is a critical success factor in just about the success of any healthcare practice today. Whether it's acknowledged or not acknowledged in some cases, the internet is the driver of whether some healthcare practices flourish or are frustrated. So I think, though, that while that sounds challenging, I've always thought that healthcare practices have a huge advantage in digital marketing. And the advantage they have is they just understand the mental framework of diagnostics. They understand how to deconstruct visible patterns to find a root cause, which I'm here to share with you. Not every business has that mental framework and really adapts to that line of thinking very well. So if we take that mental framework of diagnostics and apply it to digital marketing, well, we can come up with some really big revelations. In fact, with not a lot of time and not a lot of effort, we can use diagnostics to discover the cause of an ineffective media spend. If you ever thought your media dollars aren't going as far as they should be, we can figure out why that is. And with digital marketing diagnostics, we can figure out why you think you have a lot of website visitors, but few new patients. Boy, and this is super relevant to me, just working with a practice just the other day who had this very frustration. We get a lot of people to our website, but nobody does the thing that we want them to do. And with diagnostics, unfortunately, even today in 2021, we can still figure out why maybe you have so few website visitors to begin with. And here's a frustration for a lot of healthcare practices. Why is their front office, the reception area, tied up answering the same questions day after day, hour after hour? All of that with diagnostics, we can figure out. Now, the diagnostic tools in digital marketing are nowhere near as technologically impressive as the diagnostic tools available in the healthcare industry, which are amazing. But there are some great diagnostic tools available in digital marketing. Of course, Google Analytics, the most widely known. We're going to talk quite a bit about Google Analytics coming up, but also web trends. And here's a case where it may not be the advantage to be first to market. Web Trends was the first available sold website analytics program evolved ever offered, and it's still available, a very robust program. And Omniture, a program that is great for companies that have multiple websites and they need to track visitation across multiple websites. And ClickTracks, which the data is not as deep, but much more visual and much more presentable. But most healthcare practices are relying on Google Analytics. And they should. It's the most widely used analytics program among all businesses in the United States. Why? Well, number one, I hate to say, probably because it's free. It's absolutely free. But let's take a minute and think about that. Why is Google Analytics free? Why does Google give away this incredibly robust and powerful program for free? Well, I could suggest to you that Google Analytics is actually the core of all of Google's success. Everything we know about the Google ecosystem starts and stops right here at Google Analytics. You see, if you think about it, If Google gives businesses and website publishers the tools to analyze, diagnose, and improve their websites, that means that you and I as consumers have better things to choose from when we go to a Google search engine results page. If we have better things to choose from when we go to a Google search engine results page, we're more likely to continue using Google. So the whole cycle of customer satisfaction for Google actually begins and ends with Google Analytics. So it's within their very best interest to make this as productive and powerful a program as it can be, and they have. So let's see what it has in store for us, and let's talk about the 5 symptoms of an unhealthy new patient acquisition strategy. The first symptom that I see in talking to healthcare practices, and this is going to sound kind of crazy, frankly, but the first symptom I can tell is when people will say, you don't really know what prospective patients call you. And so when I talk about you don't know what patients call you, it's because people take this for granted. People say, well, how could this be different? How could this be varied? What would be different about what people call my practice name? And the reason I think this is a question for healthcare practices is because, a lot of us grew up in the era of the yellow pages. When finding a healthcare practice was you ran your fingers down an alphabetized list. There really wasn't a great variance there, right? There wasn't any confusion about this. But today, things are dramatically different. Take a look at this data from a popular plastic surgeon in Winter Park, Florida. Look at just the number of iterations that people type into Google just to find them, right? So it's not as simple as knowing what single name to look for. So right off the bat here, we see how dramatically things have changed in the digital era. Brands are no longer in control of what they are called. Brands are no longer in control of their own brand name. Now let's add a column to this data and look at what the impact of this is. Let's look at a very popular vein practice in Fort Myers, Florida. And the column I've added here on the right is I've added the average position of where their website falls on the Google search engine results page when the exact combination of words on your left is typed into Google. Now, I call this average position, which is what Google calls it, because the results that people see, consumers see, vary based on the location, the time of day, the device they're using, their own search history. We all don't get the same search engine results pages. So Google reports it back then as the average position. So then look closely then at that right-hand column and look how much it varies with the different combinations when people seek the same doctor. It goes all the way from position number 2, all the way down to this on line 20, this variation of the same name for the same doctor falls on position 6.9. And to give you some context, there are typically 10 things on a Google search engine results page. So on this slide, if you see 6.9, that means they were on page number 1, and on average, the 7th element on that page. Wow. Think about this for just a minute. These searchers are looking for this practice. That's what they want, but it's not the number 1 thing on the Google search engine results page. It's the 7th thing on the Google search engine results page. Now, this gets even a little bit more complicated when you have practices that have generic names. For example, this practice, allergy and asthma specialist. This name is going to be shortened by consumers to asthma specialist, right? Because consumers are lazy. In fact, if you're taking notes in today's presentation, I'd ask you to write this down because it's game changing. And that is that you will never lose money overestimating how lazy people are on the internet. So they'll take a shortcut like calling this practice asthma specialist. Well, that unfortunately is the same combination of words that people type into Google to find any asthma doctor or allergy doctor. So look what happens when you type into Google allergy specialist. This brand whose name is allergy specialist, that's them there at the very, very bottom of your screen. That's them. And look at all the real estate in front of them. So let's clarify this. Consumer goes to Google, has a previous relationship with this practice, types in their variation of the name, the consumer's variation, what they remember, what they recall, types that into Google, and the practice is not anywhere close to being the first thing on that Google search engine results page. Okay. So let's reinforce the point that brands are no longer in control of what patients refer to them. So what's the implications if this is left untreated? Well, it happens at a higher level than you probably expect, but that means that already paying customers, people that have already forged a relationship with you, can't find you. Again, never underestimate how lazy people are on the internet. And the second implication if this is not treated is that your best prospects, the ones that already have some positive affiliation with you, can't find you. And in the healthcare practice where this is particularly damaging is from referrals. So if Dr. A refers Dr. B and the patient uses that positive momentum to look for Dr. B and can't find Dr. B, we've just wasted the power of the most influential form of marketing available, a referral, because they couldn't find us. Well, and here, this happens a whole lot more than you would expect too. You may find that your marketing dollars are actually helping another business. Now, I work with a law firm, by the way, who takes full advantage of this name confusion. I work with some clients who, when they get somebody on the phone, they realize that they're not the practice that they're actually looking for. They say, oh, I think you're actually looking for this doctor or this practice. And those are good people, and that happens all the time. I work with a law firm that does exactly the opposite. Even when they detect that it's probably not them that this person is calling about, they say, yeah, come on in, you bet. Come on in, we've got an appointment at 2:00, come on in, and they take full advantage of it. So something as simple as your name could be a symptom of an unhealthy digital new patient acquisition practice. Here's the second symptom that I see quite a bit, that a doctor or a healthcare practice doesn't really know how well they're performing in different geographies. And by the way, I totally understand why this happens, because a lot of doctors and a lot of office managers that are driving the marketing decisions grew up, like I did, in the era of mass media, television, newspaper, radio. And it's hard for you to visualize that a radio station would have weaknesses in a particular geography, right? We don't visualize that. Television station, we don't think that the television signals travels differently over one city than it does over another city. It's just not part of our makeup and how we analyze media. Digital media is not that way. Now, I want to add two things to our analysis of this point for a little bit of flavor here. The one, and this is really important, is that for Google searches, just a little bit less than a quarter of them all have more than 3 words. So they're getting longer. So people are getting more specific in what they type into Google. And this is driven by some changes in technology, right? We're now doing more voice searches than we are typing in. So 4 and 5 and 6 word searches are becoming more the norm. So I'm giving you a static data point on the screen, but I should let you know that this trend line is continuing in this direction in a rather strong way. So why is this relevant to healthcare practices? Let's add one more data point to this. And that is that 46% of all Google searches are what Google calls local. And what Google calls local searches means that those queries, what someone types into Google, includes the words near me or includes some type of geographic indicator. Dentist in Maitland, Florida, dentist that does root canal in Oviedo, Florida, right? That long 4-word plus phrase plus a geographic indicator. That's really the arena that healthcare practices are working in. That kind of search query is critical for success. So let's take a look at some of the implications for this. We're gonna go back to that really super vein practice in Fort Myers, Florida. And you can see here in Fort Myers, they have 2 competitors that are on their side of the river. And rivers tend to do some weird things to consumers. This has nothing to do with digital, but they perform kind of psychological barriers. And I'm coming to you from Orange County, Florida. And just not too far away, we've got the St. John River that separates Seminole County, Florida and Volusia County, Florida. And people that live in Volusia County, Florida will drive further to the east away from the river than they will across the river to neighboring Seminole County for healthcare practices, right? They just formed some kind of a weird barrier in there. But despite that, this vein center is experiencing something very, very interesting. So if we go into Google Analytics, we can actually see the data by the origin of where the person was when they did the search. So we can see, what did they do? How many pages did they consume? How long did they spend on the website? And did they do the action that that website is designed to do? Now, prior to this program, maybe you didn't expect to see such huge variance in the results on a city by city basis, but they are. In fact, if we blow this up just a little bit, we can see there at the top, kind of not surprising on the far right-hand side, this practice does less effectively in Fort Myers than it does across the river. Why? Because those two other practices are affecting them for searches that include the phrase Fort Myers. When the phrase includes Cape Coral or near me, this practice is ranking higher. So they're getting more traffic and they're doing better. The takeaway here is that there's a difference. If you didn't do the diagnosis to do the difference, you can't take the steps necessary to ameliorate some of that difference, right? To reconcile this and make those more equal. And if we look at the second set of red lines, you can see Lehigh Acres, which is on the Fort Myers side of the river, and Cypress Lake, which is on the Cape Coral side of the river. You see that same pattern. So something is happening on the digital marketing of this practice where they've got this fairly strident line of success, this side of the river versus the other side of the river. So why do we care about that? What's the implications of this is left untreated? Clearly, new patient growth is going to be stunted because it's kind of like playing with only half the tennis court. Imagine that your opponent is playing with the full width of the tennis court, but you don't know it, but you're only playing with half the width of the tennis court. You're just not going to score as many points. So to be able, if we leave this untreated, we're going to let them have a limited opportunity for success. The growth is going to be stunted. We have to absolutely solve this. The other thing that will happen if this is left untreated is, people will make flawed judgments about the whole because of a flaw in the part. So you might have a practice, and this happens quite a bit. They'll say, oh, well, I tried that, name the technique, pay-per-click, paid social media, organic social media. I tried that, fill in the name of the technique, and it didn't work. One truth, if you broke it down, it really did work, but it worked in one segment of the data. But they overextended the observation of what didn't work into the whole. Now, I've also seen that same thing show up in larger strategic decisions. I have seen practices say, well, we can't expand to city X because we never do well in city X, as if it was some cosmic force that was impeding their success. And in reality, when you diagnose it and break it down, it's probably an action that can be changed that would have made them do just as well in city X as all of the other cities. So when I talk to a healthcare practice and I see that they don't really have a clear understanding or a conversant in how well they do in different smaller geographic pockets, to me, that's a clear symptom that there's probably a weakness in their new patient acquisition strategy. A third symptom that I see is that a practice really doesn't know what the prospects are looking for. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of a confession here. This one is almost universally true to nearly every business, and this particular one is not unique to healthcare, but it's a really powerful one. So I wanted to include it in this presentation. Let me show you what I mean. You can look at a lot of plastic surgeon websites, and this data is from a plastic surgeon website, and you will see a page about Botox. I think Botox last year cracked, the top 30 or top 20 pharmaceuticals sold in the United States of America. So almost every plastic surgeon has on their website a page about the benefits of Botox, and they've got before and after pictures of Botox, and they extol the age-defying impact of Botox. But when you look at the data, like when you look at the screen, and these are actual queries from a real plastic surgeon website, People have long since progressed beyond needing to be convinced about the benefits of Botox. What you can see on the screen is what they're really looking for what's the cost of Botox? How much do I need? What's the cost of Botox per unit? How much does a single treatment cost? Right? How much do I need in my forehead? The consumer's needs here have really evolved. But yet you go to a lot of plastic surgeon websites and they don't ever touch this subject of cost. I think a lot of healthcare practices are afraid to talk about cost. In some ways, there's some insurance complications here for sure, but sometimes in cash paying practices that offer services like this and Botox, consumers know that there's a price. They know that they're going to pay. And you know that consumers think they're going to pay for something like Botox. So why not just talk about it on the page? Because the data will suggest overwhelmingly that's what they want. They don't want to know about the age-defying effects of Botox. What they want to know is how much does it cost and how much they need. So you got a clear misalignment between what consumers want and what this particular practice is providing. Here, you have a different plastic surgeon, and one of their most popular services is breast augmentation. They're very well known for it. They're very good at it, and it's a relatively profitable part of their practice. And if you go to the website, like you will a lot of plastic surgeon websites, you will see a pretty good amount of content about breast augmentation. You'll see before and after photographs, and you'll see how it builds confidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But dig into the data a little bit deeper, and you're going to see that maybe that's not the biggest market. Because in this plastic surgeon's case, actual data, when you look at the queries that have some indicator of exactly what they want, of the breast surgeon related queries, 26% of them have a context of breast enlargement or breast augmentation. But 28% of them have a context of breast reduction or implant removal. So a little bit more desire for reduction and removal than augmentation, but guess what you see when you go to the website content? What's the relationship between the amount of content about augmentation and enlargement versus reduction and implant? It's 100 to 0. There's no content on the website about breast reduction or implant removal. And yet we can see clearly that's what the consumers want. And also too, if you're a plastic surgeon or part of a plastic surgeon's office joining us, you see this too. You see male issues as it relates to breast surgery. Now, clearly we're not going to change our marketing strategy for a 3% market share, but you can go to a lot of plastic surgeon websites and never see the word MALE on it at all. And yet there is a reasonable, but not perhaps practice changing amount of search volume around men who specifically search for breast surgeon related issues. So what happens if this is left untreated? You lose new patients to practices who have figured this out. Because somebody's going to come along and go, I got it. I know what people want. And their landing page is going to be centered on exactly what people want. So this practice, this plastic surgeon that I just showed you, was fortunate to get a few people to land on the website with those search queries. If another practice came in tomorrow with a landing page that was fully optimized around breast removal and breast reduction, and that practice did it well, that traffic is going to go away. Boom, just like that. So they'll lose potentially good sales because somebody was more in alignment with what consumers are looking for. And if this is left untreated, the future is going to look bleaker because, again, we're talking about a static data point that I just showed you, but this trend line is moving. Remember, I mentioned how many words are in the average search phrase, and I told you that that's continuing to increase. Consumers are getting more and more specific. Consumers have this expectation that no matter how detailed of a search query they put in, that they're going to find something. right? So we don't expect a movement backwards, that people are going to be more generic with their searches. All the data is indicating that consumers are going to be more specific. I always like to talk about plumbers in my podcast, because we all have needed a plumber at one point or another. It's helpful to know that people rarely look for a plumber anymore. People rarely go to Google and look for a plumber. Why? Because what they do look for is someone to fix my leaky sink, or someone to fix my toilet, or someone to fix my water heater, right? Continue to get more specific. In fact, they actually will type in someone to fix my name of brand water heater, right? So as time goes on, plumbers won't need to optimize for the phrase plumber anymore. They'll simply need to optimize around what exactly people want, and that trend will be magnified by voice search. Now, not to turn this presentation into a future trends presentation, but I think we all know what's coming, and that is the age of personalization. We're seeing personalized search results to some degree now, but that's going to be where the future lies. The future will say that even though I didn't put the word male in my search query, Google will know that I'm a male, and that it will return content that has been oriented to males. So in the not too distant future, if I wanted to seek the services of a breast surgeon, I will not need to use the word male. That'll be figured out for me. So all of this personalization won't be as overtly visible as we see it now in the search query data. It'll be inferred. So if we don't have the content that lines up with the level of specifics and personalization that's going to happen in searching in the future, well, we're just not going to adapt to what is going to be the next big paradigm in Google search. This next symptom I think is interesting, and it's a little maybe concerning that we still have this conversation in 2021. When I do my presentations for Google, one of the exercises I do with healthcare practices is I ask them to close their eyes, visualize their website, and tell me what their website looks like by memory. I ask them to recall it. And after they've kind of closed their eyes and recalled it, I ask them, I say, did you see what your website looks like on a desktop computer? And they all say yes. And I say, well, that in itself is a symptom that you probably have an unhealthy new patient acquisition strategy. Because what are some things that we know? Absolutely know. 63% of all Google searches are done on a mobile device now. So if we're not preparing our content and looking at it through the same lens as our consumers are, where is that going to leave us? I'll show you where it's going to leave you. It's going to leave you with having a terrible mobile experience. So look at this data from one of our healthcare clients. You can see that kind of right on the money, right about 60% of their visits come from mobile, right over here. See this number right here? But look here. Mobile visitors consume fewer pages, and look at this. They spend half as much time on the website as visitors from the desktop. We're serving something that is clearly not as effective as the desktop version that we see in our mind's eye when we think about the website of our healthcare practice. And it's costing us. And here's another number that is likely going to continue to grow. Now, we're in the midst of a little bit of a wobble here, by the way, with the pandemic. With the pandemic, we're seeing this, what was previously this powerful straight line of mobile usage, going straight up. It has plateaued, and even in some cases gone backwards a little bit as people are working from home and more likely to be in front of a desktop computer. But I think we all believe that maybe we'll get back to whatever the normal will be, and we expect mobile usage to continue that increase. And even though it's plateaued at an extraordinary level. It's plateaued at a point that most healthcare practices still see more than 50% of their website visitors come from mobile. And maybe it was at a high of 58 or 60% prior to the pandemic, but I still don't see a lot of them that have gone backwards to the point of being less than 50%. So what's the real implication? Here's a really extraordinary case from one of our clients. Now, in this case, you can see that it's not quite 50-50, but closer to 50-50 of the number of visitors that come from mobile and desktop. But where the real implication is look at the goal conversion rate. And just to make sure that everybody's on the same point in this presentation, a conversion rate is the percentage of visitors that do the thing that the website is designed for them to do. Fill out a form, sign up for a class, request an appointment, whatever that end action is, that's called a conversion. So a conversion rate is the percentage of people that take that particular action. And the conversion rate in general, some exceptions apply, is one of the leading indicators of the effectiveness of a website. So why would there be such a gap in this case? A lot of it is because people haven't tested the functionality on all mobile browsers. You see, websites are not like televisions. If you and I have completely different brands and sizes of televisions, by and large, we're going to see the same thing. But if we have different brands of phones and we use different browsers, unless someone has paid attention to it, there is a relatively high possibility that we may not see exactly the same thing. It can't be assumed. It has to be tested. That's one factor. Then the other factor is that the easiest way to make a mobile version of a website is to let the technology, in most cases a template, a theme, just shrink the desktop version and put it into a smaller space, which for most designs isn't going to be an effective experience for the user because we need bigger buttons, we need more space between links because we're navigating with fingers rather than navigating with a mouse and a cursor. So most of the automatically driven, technology driven, turn the desktop view into a mobile view are less effective than they should be. So this divergence between the mobile experience and the desktop experience has got some enormous implications if it's left untreated. So of course, we're going to lose out on new patients because we're 100% sure that a good deal of new patients are starting their customer journey on a mobile device. Now they may finish it on a desktop. And remember, the consumer journey is kind of multi-layered and multi-steps and sometimes bounces from device to device. But most data seems to indicate that the mobile is the first impression. And what's the old saying? The old saying is you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. The second implication, if this is left untreated, is that you're going to be unable to keep up with consumer expectations because consumers are doing a funny things in the background. Consumers now are losing the perspective of what is a mobile website and what is an app. The line is blurring for them. Used to be not that long ago, they'd have a almost verbal recognition that, oh, this is my website of the school that my kid goes to, and this is an app. And they no longer have that cognitive difference. So that means that the expectations they have of their popular apps that they use, social media apps, how elegantly they operate, how smooth they are, what a great user experience they are, they kind of think that anything on their phone should have that same level of experience. But it doesn't, right? I mean, you can judge by your own case. There's probably a mobile website that you've used recently. I mean, my wife and I were shopping on Home Depot's mobile website the other day and thought, oh my gosh, getting ready to throw the device out the window. It was terrible. It was absolutely horrible. But where did our expectation come from? You know, if we sat back and thought about it, it really wasn't that bad. It was certainly a lot less time than driving to the store and walking up and down those aisles. But natively, we were comparing it to what's our dominant experience on our phones, our apps, super smooth, super easy, and we didn't have that experience. So we kind of graded it much lower than it probably was in reality because of our relative comparison to our apps. And the final implication of not dealing with this is right? You never master the ZMOT. And for those of you who were marketing students in college, that phrase looks familiar. It's a derivative of the MOT, the moment of truth, that was developed in the late 60s and 70s. And back in the 60s and 70s, that was referring to when a consumer picked up a package off of a grocery store shelf and looked at it, and they had a moment of truth. The packaging determined whether or not they put it in the cart or whether they put it back on the shelf. So marketers began to understand that moment of truth, and packaging became kind of a fulcrum of consumer goods marketing. You know, they say now that over 60% of the products that you buy in a grocery store, the packaging actually costs more than the product itself. In the digital era, they've added the zero moment of truth to that instead of moment of truth, and it responds to the first interaction you have with the brand. So I do a Google search, I see the ad, I click on the website, and consumers make this highly superficial, not very thoughtful judgment of what the brand is in an instant. And many studies have measured it to be literally less than a second. And some of the things that people respond to in these surveys are colors and shapes and a bunch of things that, to no surprise, have little to do with the underlying qualifications or attributes of the product. So this probably doesn't surprise you that consumers are, in general, relatively superficial. But if our first impression is going to be on a mobile device, that's where we have to master that zero moment of truth, that first impression that's going to determine whether or not that consumer engages, goes one step further, looks at another page, and potentially takes an action, or just clicks, hits the back button, opens up another tab, and goes to another Google search. We're getting down to the bottom of the presentation, and the fifth symptom I see most often in talking to healthcare practices is they don't really know where their marketing dollar is going the furthest. Again, I think they just kind of look at this ubiquitously and say, well, I'm spending this and it must all go to an equal place and all have an equal level of effect. And really nothing could be further than the truth. So if we diagnose this a little bit further and we dig across the data, every business will have a pattern, every one. And so here, what you see on the right-hand side is we're going to analyze the traffic by the source. And on the right-hand side, we see the conversion rate for that source. And so here, look down at the very bottom of this, and you can see that this particular practice has a 12.24% conversion rate. Again, percentage of people that do the desired action when the visitor comes from a referral source. Now, what's a referral source? A referral source is where another website has a link to your website. And in the healthcare space, many, many times that's going to be a relevant directory, right? There's a directory for almost every healthcare discipline: vein surgeons, plastic surgeons, dentists. They all have their own directories. And some of those directories do better at organic search, right? They rank higher. So they get that initial traffic. So that consumer goes to the directory then, and the directory then is the vehicle through which they find your practice. When they've kind of gone through that filter, that gauntlet, if you will, not surprisingly, they're a little bit more educated and now more likely to take the desired action. So you see that showing up here with this practice. But what I want to point out is at the top of that red column, because while ranking in organic is, for many practices, the holy grail, because after a somewhat expenditure, we don't pay per click. So a lot of practices rightly say, if we can get to that point of strong organic ranking, we're not dependent on paid dollars all the time. And that's generally true. But here in this case, this practice does not do as well with traffic that comes from organic as it does when you can see from line 5, the branded paid search, and then also from local search on line 4. So what would we do with this data? Well, I'm a big believer in sailing with the wind, right? And not sailing against the wind. So do we kill ourselves and try to invest time and money into ranking better on Google with this practice? No. Why? We can figure out what that friction point is later, but if we want to increase patients tomorrow, that's not going to be our path of least resistance. So that's one way that we're going to look at the data. Now, you might think that every practice is the same, but let's look at this practice and look at again, the healthy response rate from referrals, which is very, very common in the healthcare, not as common in other business, very common. But look at line 3, and here look at paid search. This is typically more in line what you'll see with a lot of healthcare practices and a lot of businesses, because as consumers become more sophisticated, most consumers now realize that they are clicking on an ad. So think about that for just a minute. The consumer consciously clicks on an ad. So they have this expectation that they're going to be sold something, offered something. So they are probably mentally more prepared to take an action than a searcher that finds the same practice through an organic listing or through social media. So in general, you might find as a healthcare practice that in general, always exceptions, that the paid traffic converts a little bit higher, which is what you see here on the screen. So here we've got the same thing, except we still want to sail with the wind, but in this case, the wind is coming from a completely different direction on it. So when I talk to a healthcare practice that isn't conversant, or at least isn't digesting the different media channels that are available digitally, then I can say, well, that's a practice that probably has an unhealthy new patient acquisition strategy. So what happens if this is left untreated? Of course, you spend time, budget, and attention in the wrong areas. And I think we can all grab onto the money part of this. Yeah, we spend money in the wrong areas. But I also see a lot of practices get lost in the time and attention area of this. See a lot of practices that kind of get wrapped up in social media. It's cool, it's hip, it's great, but it's harder for a healthcare practice to do well in social media than it is for another business on that. And there are some practices that are succeeding, by the way, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. If it's not paying off, then we gotta punt. And it can be a time suck. It can be an attention suck. It can be a management attention suck. And we got to get out of there. And so we could be spending our time, money, and effort just in the wrong place. But really, of course, if you've got your new patient acquisition cost down, your new patient acquisition cost is probably being artificially inflated because money is flowing to the least effective areas. So if you look back at your 2020 data and you've analyzed your new patient acquisition cost, it's probably higher than it should be with just by making a simple change, just by moving time and effort into a channel where you're facing less resistance. And then if we don't treat it, we're really vulnerable to a competitor trying to dominate a single channel. So, if we don't look at this data, if we don't really study it, and we continue to put all of our eggs in one basket, and somebody comes in and they have their, epiphany moment and they start dominating a particular channel, this is all fluid. Digital marketing changes rapidly. So the fact that we're number 1 or number 2 today in no way guarantees that we're going to be number 1 or number 2 next month or even next week. In fact, the way that SEO works is the very premise of SEO is that we have to figure out why the people in front of us are ranking the way that they are. What are they doing? And then once we get that as the game plan, then we go do more of what they're doing to beat them. So by its very nature, SEO is unlikely to be static. And similarly, paid search is the same way. When you're in it, you can move it. And so one of our competitors is going to step in front of us if we're not paying attention to this kind of data. So how can we get better at these diagnostics? I think we've agreed with this point in the presentation, there's a real value to taking the same mental framework of diagnosing an illness to diagnosing our new patient strategy. Well, our first step simply is we have to fully install Google Analytics. And note that I've used the word fully install there. Most installations are not set up completely. There's a lot of things to Google Analytics. You can put it on the site. It can report some baseline data, but you won't be using the full bandwidth of it unless you make sure that it's fully installed down there. And I'm a big believer in knowing what you're trying to win, right? I'm a big believer if you don't know the target, the weapon really doesn't matter. So if you don't really know already your KPIs, what is a tolerable cost per new patient? What percentage of people that contact you for an appointment actually convert to an appointment? And how many of those actually show up? Those are all key numbers to know, because when we know those KPIs, then we can back into a strategy that is less risky because we know the parameters. The better you know your KPIs, the better you know your parameters, the less risk you take. And I think no matter what stage of relationship you have with a digital agency, always going to be helpful to have a relationship with a qualified analytics professional. To me, this is very simply the same as having a CPA. It's no different. You don't rely on the CPA to give you the data. You rely on the CPA to interpret the data and to guide you to a more optimal use of your funds, of your incoming revenue, of your expenses. So having a qualified analytics on your team, professional on your team, it's just no different than having a CPA. And many of you on the program today simply would not run your practice without having an access to a CPA. So we're about to close the program, but I want to close with these three kind of overarching thoughts just for your consideration as you try to meld everything that we've talked about today together. And one is, and this is an overarching truth, and it does extend beyond healthcare, that for consumers, what they want to hear is more important than you want to say. Ouch. That's really tough for a lot of businesses and a lot of healthcare practices to internalize, because we all want to talk about how great we are, how much experience we have, how long our practice has been around. This is where the doctor went to the college, blah, blah, blah. I got to tell you, you look at the data, and increasingly that's not persuasive content. The more in tune you are with what consumers want to hear, what new patients want to hear, the better you're going to do. And that's going to continue to be the case as we get more and more personalized with some of the offerings that we're going to see in the digital marketplace. And here's the other thought I want to leave you with, second of three, is that the distance between you and your competition is measured in just a single click. So when we talk about some of these things, I think you're maybe going to leave and go, really? Does that happen? Are consumers really that fickle? Yes, they are. And they're fickle because they can be. They're fickle because all it takes to find something else is click. That's it. That's very different than the old days of when you would drive to a store, and if it didn't have exactly what you wanted, you might go, I'm going to buy it because I drove all the way down there. I spent the money on gas. Never happens anymore. Consumers are fickle because they can be, and your competitor is just a single click away. Last thought I want to leave you with is that digital marketing is an ongoing regimen. And this is, again, why I do love working with healthcare practices, because this point is easier made with healthcare practices than it is a lot of businesses. It's easy to convince a healthcare practice that, to be healthy, it's not a one-time thing, right? You can't go on a diet for 2 weeks and expect to have a lifetime of better health because you went on a diet for 2 weeks. Same thing with digital marketing. We can do all these things one time, but we're only going to get limited results. It's a continual effort. Consumers are changing. Technology is changing. Your competition is changing. We can't be static. We can't be, because every other thing in this digital ecosystem is changing around us. And so we simply have to keep pace. So let's recap just a little bit. What are the 5 symptoms? See if you're experiencing these. Maybe you are. Maybe you're not willing to admit it, but here's some of the 5 symptoms of an unhealthy practice that we talked about today that you really don't know what prospects call you. If you really can't verbalize that to a great detail, it's probably an indicator that things aren't going to go as well for you as they could be. You think you're performing well in all geographies. Why wouldn't you be, right? You think that the internet is pervasive beyond geographic boundaries. You don't really know what your prospects want. You haven't looked at your website on a phone recently, like a consumer would. And of course, the last symptom is you may not know where your dollars are going the furthest. 5 symptoms of an unhealthy patient strategy. So I hope if we've given you any kind of indicator today that you are experiencing these symptoms, that you know where to go for help. And if you have any further questions about any of them, Here's how you can contact Roar. You can find us at our website at roarontheweb.com. You can find us on Facebook, and if you post a question on our Facebook page, one of our folks will answer it for you. On Twitter, we're at Best Web Design FL. And if there's a question that I can answer for you personally, feel free to email me at mweber@roarontheweb.com. Hey, well, it's been great being with you today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day for this webinar. And if you would like a copy of the recording, you can reach out to me. Or if one of our folks here at Roar was the introductory path for you to find the webinar today, you can reach out to them and we'll make sure you get the recording. Thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great weekend and have a healthy practice.